space under socialism. And as NRO's already indicated, both topics seem strangely relevant. Private space because we have too much of it, and public space because we don't get enough of it. You could argue that this Zoom webinar transforms private space into some sort of public space. And it is in this hybrid public-private environment that I would like to welcome our guest, Vladimir Kulić. And Vladimir, let me start off with a personal question. What is your favorite public space and why?
First, thank you for having me, Justin and Rose. It's really fun to actually make this little break in our kind of continuous time, right? That we're living these days indoors and inside and without much public interaction. So it's very nice to actually take a break from that, even though it's virtual, right? As much of life has become in the past days. I live in Iowa now. It was a long and cold winter. And to answer your question, I think I would like to say that it's probably somewhere on the coast of the Adriatic in the summer. I think that captures both the kind of the joyous space that revives us, right, in direct contact with nature, but also in some ways it reflects my own very personal historical experience with socialism growing up in a socialist country where access to such natural resources as the coast of the sea was, and it's all of its restorative qualities was instilled in the population for the first time really in history during that period. It was, in a way, as a number of my colleagues historians have shown, it was really one of the projects of socialism to make that restorative experience available to hopefully everyone, but at least the majority of the population. And that was unprecedented in historical terms for anyone in the region.
Right. Well, maybe speaking about growing up in a socialist environment, socialism is a kind of utopian model, and there have been some utopian socialist cities. I'm thinking of Stalinstadt, which later was renamed Eisenhüttenstadt. There is Novi Beograd. Of course, you are very well aware of that place. You once gave me a fantastic tour through New Belgrade. There are other places as well. Can you tell us a little bit what comprises a socialist model city?
Well, I don't think there's a one model city, actually. But the very question that we're talking about, an ideal city, I think is very indicative because in some ways, socialism itself is a product of a much deeper line of thinking in modern times, right? This utopian thinking that goes back centuries, and it's deeply ingrained into the kind of deeper fabric of modernity. And in some ways, these radical visions of different life are not the products of some parallel world, right, that existed somewhere out there in the East, right? But they're really deeply ingrained in the fabric of all of modern societies. I would say that even the ones that you mentioned, the Stalinstadt or New Belgrade and others, I'm not even sure I would call them really utopian, because they're very much existing cities, right? They're actually physically there, and they continue functioning. Eisenhüttenstadt, right, perhaps is now demonstrating the problems of the population, right, that came with the fall of communism in East Germany. But New Belgrade, on the other hand, is very much still thriving, right, on this deep infrastructure that socialism constructed. My friend Kimberly Zerkor, who might be in the audience, actually wrote this about this infrastructural thinking that gave rise to socialist cities. So I would say that perhaps is one of the defining features. But even if we speak about truly visionary utopian, unrealized utopias, even in that respect, there are no kind of unified single examples. I'm going to share the slide now, right? I just picked from the top of my head these three, right? Very famous ones in some respects. All three produced under various socialist states, whether Miliutin Socgorod or the Hansen's linear continuous system in Poland, or Wenceslaw Richter's vision of kind of a synthetic urbanism for a self-managing Yugoslav city. Right, they're in their physical form radically different, and if there's anything that perhaps ties them together, it's the vision of totality, right? Which ultimately really goes back to the roots of utopian thinking, which is about harmonizing the totality of society rather than allowing partial individual interests to run amok at the expense of others.
Well, can I ask you something about that? You speak about the vision of totality, and many people would associate socialist space with state control, these broad avenues where mass parades could take place. But of course, there were also individual people living there. And could you say something maybe between the dynamics between attempted state control on the one hand and the private use, or maybe even the private appropriation of public space on the other?
Well, that's a kind of a really loaded question, right? I think because of the kind of Cold War indoctrination, right? We tend to ascribe this kind of use of space only to that other side, right? To the world behind the Iron Curtain, right? I mean, this is the way. This is also something that's much more deeply ingrained into the fabric of modern societies, right? The ceremonial use for the celebration of a state is not something that was invented in socialism, right? It was only itself, in a way, appropriated, right, from capitalist states themselves. So in that respect, I think that we really need to kind of start, how do I put it? Start dismantling this very clear-cut opposition, right, between that world behind the Iron Curtain, right, that was where all of the kind of socialist thinking was during the Cold War relegated to a different geographical area, right? Because ultimately these ideas were much more closely intertwined, and I think that also the socialist world, even if we talk about the Cold War time, the socialist world was far from monolithic. So it's very difficult to speak about one particular experience of, I don't know, appropriating public space, right? To some degree, I would say that those broad avenues used for parades, right, were as much of a public space as was what I mentioned at the beginning, the coast of the Adriatic, right, which we would never associate, right, with the stereotypical image of socialism, but it was very much that.
Yeah. So would you say that the stereotypical Cold War perspective emphasizes the differences between East and West, whereas maybe the parallels and continuities were at least as important, or maybe even more important? And if so, can you maybe mention some examples of parallel developments in urban development or urban planning in East and West?
Well, there are really many, and you know, I recently started teaching a course on the history of global socialism, architecture of global socialism, and we have been digging much deeper into the history of socialism beyond the Cold War period, and it emerges as a much more kind of significant historical continuum than we are willing often to accept because of these ingrained Cold War divisions. So I recently went to Guise in France, where one of the most remarkable examples of utopian socialism, of realized utopian socialism, existed for over 100 years, right? For almost 130 years. Godin's Familistère, right, which was a big industrial compound, owned originally by its founder, Jean-Baptiste Godin, who, however, over time gave the ownership to the workers. So it's for about 100 years, the entire place functioned as communally owned enterprise, and where they constructed massive buildings for habitation with unusually comfortable apartments for the time, but all of them organized around these very large glazed courtyards. And in some ways, I think this is indicative of perhaps what is kind of the defining feature, perhaps, of socialism, and that is to really shift the accent from private ownership and the kind of utopia of the market, right? I like that phrase that Karl Polanyi created, right? Market, the idea that the market should run everything in society is the ultimate utopia of modernity, and it's detrimental to society. So in this way, I think that this Familistère is in a way some kind of a good example of how even within capitalist societies there was the ingrained push and the need to find those oases that protect society from the corrosive effects of the market, where particular interests run at the expense of everyone else. Not sure whether that how much that responds.
No, I think it's a great example.
But to go back, yes, I'm sorry. Your question was really about the differences, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, the difference, but actually more the parallels, because we wanted to take down the stereotypical divide between East and West as two completely opposed ideological power blocks. So it's interesting to see, speaking about urban planning and public space, how these parallels are actually at least as important.
Yes, and you asked me about New Belgrade specifically. I'm going to show a slide, right? This is the master plan of the center of New Belgrade from 1959, 1960, right? This is again, as you mentioned, right? We talked about this as one of the most important symbolic spaces of Yugoslav socialism. But ultimately, to further dismantle this construct of absolute difference, right? Ultimately, this is the ultimate high modernist model that was applied kind of in remarkably similar ways during the Cold War in the East and the West, in the North and in the South, right? So if you, fundamentally, really in terms of the logic of organization of space, this is very much in parallel to Brasilia or to Chandigarh, or to even perhaps we could say the state capital of New York in Albany, right? Which kind of so these parallels tie together very, very different political and economic systems and very different positions of power in the global system during the Cold War.
Right. So can you tell us a little bit more now that we are speaking about Belgrade, about the quite unique position of Yugoslavia between East and West and its implications for its position maybe in the middle, also in terms of architecture and urban planning?
Yes, I think, I've been struggling with this question for a long time, right? I have worked on Yugoslavia for now, kind of, it's scary to say, more than 20 years. And I often get this question, is there something unique? Is there some kind of Yugoslav style of architecture? And I would say there's definitely not, right? And perhaps that's precisely the point. I would say if I were to try to kind of concisely formulate the difference between Yugoslavia from other socialist countries, but perhaps also from Western countries as well, then it would be the remarkable flourishing of the various forms of architecture that was developed during the time. Kind of politically speaking, fundamentally, Yugoslavia was different from other East European countries at the level of decentralization of the state and of the system, as well as a product of that, of culture, and then of architecture itself. So there was a kind of a flourishing of a number of parallel architectural cultures in Yugoslavia that produced really I still do think a remarkable variety of different takes on modernism, right? Whether on the high modernism as what we see on the screen in New Belgrade, but also all kinds of other kind of inflections on modernist thinking, whether with kind of deliberately regionalist overtones or much more universalist ideas, right? Where if you go to Skopje, right, which is not so far from Belgrade, you will see a very different version of modernism, right? What we usually associate with brutalism, but it's fundamentally, spatially, as well as materially and formally, quite a different deflection of modernism. In Sarajevo, we will see examples of the regionalism inspired by the much longer kind of long durée Balkan tradition associated with Ottoman architecture. In Slovenia and Croatia, we will see much deeper connections to Central European modernisms. Italy, Sweden, right, Scandinavia. There were intense international connections, and I would say that this kind of melting pot. Yugoslavia emerged as some kind of architectural melting pot of the era internationally that somehow put in close proximity very different kinds of architecture.
Right. So why is it, would you say, that when socialist urban planning and socialist architecture is so much part of an international story of modernism, that in the historiography, in the writing about urban planning, there is still this divide between East and West? Why is that?
Well, you know, we're still sort of living in kind of the aftermath of the Cold War, and I think only in the past 10 years, right, when the liberal consensus started really seriously unraveling with first the recession in the late 2000s, and now especially, right, this ongoing crisis is posing all kinds of questions in front of us. I think everyone was really pushed to start questioning these broader, these entrenched perspectives, and taking kind of a much broader historical perspective into account. So I would say that historiography itself is not the problem. Actually, I would say in the past 10, 15 years, there has been an incredible wave of the historical work among historians in general, but also architecture historians. Many of my colleagues have participated in that through various platforms, including Second World Urbanity, that have all of us in a way have contributed to the unraveling of this attempt to formulate these absolute divisions, right? I would say that nowadays much bigger problem is now the remnants of the popular opinions, right, about socialism in general, but also about the particular period of the Cold War. I think that to go back to Yugoslavia, probably most people in the audience will be familiar with the phenomenon of so-called spomenic, right, or Yugoslav World War II memorials, which have found their place now in the social media, right, as kind of a pop culture phenomenon, right, where these disembodied images have been circulated ad nauseum, right, with the accompanying interpretation that these are now objects that are emptied of any meaning, right, and they can be sort of appropriated by this global culture for whatever purpose they might have, whether for pop bands to shoot their video clips there, or most notoriously, right, for a fashion company to use the monument to the concentration camp in Jasenovac, which you see on the upper right corner, to use it as the site for their promotional campaign. So it's more, I think it's more about this popular perception, right, that feeds on the surviving stereotypes about the Cold War than it is about historiography. I actually think that historians are doing a remarkable job in dismantling these dichotomies, and in that sense, I really would like to see more of expert knowledge kind of becoming kind of penetrating the popular culture as well, right? But you know, I recently just, you know, the popular interpretation currently is that the current times are leading towards the dismantling of expert knowledge. So maybe it's just a symptom of a much larger problem.
Right. So let's finally talk a little bit before we go to Q&A about the changes after 1989, 1991, the period of transition, the end of state socialism. What happened with public space? I'm thinking, for instance, about all those squares with large Lenin monuments that were taken down or maybe sometimes replaced by new nationalist mythological figures. What would you say is the main trend there?
That's another great question, right? And you have written about this, right? About this change of this re-semantization of public space, right? Through the replacement or removal of monuments, installment of new ones, etc. However, I really think there's a deeper kind of meaning that emerges out of this phenomenon of post-socialism, right? Or so supposed transition, right, to capitalism, which reveals these fundamental differences that are not in shape, that are not in aesthetics, but are really fundamentally about access and ownership. And one really remarkable example is what you see on the screen, the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw. My colleague, Michał Murawski, recently published a fantastic book about the anthropology of this building, which in theory should be really the most reviled monument to everything that was bad about socialism, right? This is the ultimate monument to Stalinism, right? The symbol of Soviet encroachment in Poland. And yet, paradoxically, this building, 70 years now after its construction and 30 years after the collapse of socialism, as Michał argues, survives as still socialist, right? Because it ultimately is the ultimate public space, right? It's the tallest building in Poland, the largest, supposedly the largest square in Europe around it, and it houses so many essential public programs inside that have shaped the historical experience of so many people that its a kind of position, its perception in the public opinion is still overwhelmingly positive, right? Despite all of these negative associations with Stalinism, you know, especially from kind of a nationalist perspective, right? The Soviet incursion. So in that respect, it is really about the ownership of the space. As Michał argues, this building is simply, and the space around it are so large that they simply, due to that, resist any attempt for the neoliberal city to encroach upon them, and they successfully remain still socialist. If we go, what I mentioned at the beginning, the Adriatic coast, I think there's an interesting counterpoint, really, which again highlights the predominance of the issues of ownership and access. And I want to show this image as an excellent example. This is the Haludovo resort on the island of Krk in Croatia, which was probably one of the most luxurious high-end resorts in Yugoslavia, produced in the early 1970s, fraught with all kinds of paradoxes. But this was the place where the international jet set elite congregated, from American gamblers to Saddam Hussein to Olof Palme, right? So regardless of kind of ideological positions, the elite was here, and yet, despite this super high-end resort functioning on the coast, the beach that you see on the outside was nevertheless public throughout this time. So in a way, this was a place of encounter for people of different cultures and geographical origins, but also kind of bridging the various class divides. After the collapse of the Yugoslav socialist state, the entire resort was privatized, but the current owner, who is international tycoon, refuses to invest the money. Basically, the entire complex was left to deteriorate, and its current owner refuses to invest in its renovation unless the local community allows him to close off the entire area and to create a gated resort where the beach would become private. And I think this is an incredibly powerful indicator, right, of what this is really all about, right? It is fundamentally about ownership and about the control of access to space.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Vladimir. This is very intriguing and interesting. I suggest that we go to the Q&A now. Please feel free to send your questions. I will read them or show them on screen, and we have still 10 minutes left to go over them. Let me see. Here we have Hitel Master. Do you think the similarities between the East and West are because of the architects that got involved over the period of time, as they invited architects from all over eventually?
Hello, Hitel. Hitel is my student, so great to see you. Thank you for the question. I think that ultimately, I think that the similarities are due to the fact that socialism as kind of an impulse, as a mode of thinking, is much more deeply ingrained in the fabric of modernity than we have been kind of conditioned to believe because of the Cold War divisions. I have another really good image to show in this respect, and I want to share. There was about 5 years ago, there was an excellent exhibition at the Berlinische Gallery in Berlin, which was dedicated to the architecture of Berlin in the 1960s. Berlin, of course, was that kind of iconic place of division, right, where the two ideological systems were put in close contact and in close competition. And one of the remarkable outcomes of this exhibition was to show how similar ultimately architectural visions were at that time, right? Despite this really perhaps most intense ideological rivalry that happened in this city and at that time. So yeah, I would say perhaps that in a way your kind of statement, Hitel, is perhaps right. We do need to kind of look at these cross connections much more closely. And then again, a lot of colleagues have done that.
Vladimir, thank you. I have to alert you that we're only seeing the desktop now in this part of the, so we can't
sorry.
use the PowerPoint anymore. That's fine, but your answer was very clear, I think. I move to the next one, John Gary. Is Warsaw's Palace of Culture and Science still popular in part because it's neo-traditional rather than modernist? Oh. Because it is decorated rather than minimal? Oh,
okay. So yeah,
you can see the question. Okay.
Yes, that's a great question too, right? I think that Michal in his book makes the point of, you know, he's an anthropologist, so his argument is really that this building has been an essential part of the urban life of Warsaw for such a long time that it simply cannot be torn out of that fabric anymore. The question of style, right, is always pertinent, right? And the shift to socialist realism in the first place, of course, happened to some degree simply because the avant-garde attempt to invent a completely new kind of architecture, as was often argued, simply was not accepted, quote unquote, by the masses. And this question of style is always kind of with us, whether we're talking about socialism or not, right? The case of Skopje perhaps is indicative of this as well, where this new brutalist cosmopolitan city that was constructed there in the 60s and the 70s has been recently completely reshaped by the nationalist government into this kind of fanciful stage set of faux classical facades. But then I'm also wondering, you know, whether it's really so much different in this country, right? The current president of the United States recently announced that he would require all of the federal buildings to be designed in a classical style. So it's you know, in some ways, the question of taste, a kind of popular taste in particular, inserts itself into these discussions in unexpected ways throughout the period.
Right. Vladimir, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to be very concise in the rest of your answers because we have a lot of them, and let's see how far we get.
Oh my God, yes, I see.
Yeah, so Daisy Smith, about the public refusal to allow the tycoon to privatize the beach in Kirk.
Yes, it's great. Actually, the local community, the local municipality decided to not allow that. This is one of the small victories, right? If we can call it a victory, because the entire complex remains a ruin, right? But at least the victory was in the sense that the local community decided not to allow this encroachment and privatization of access.
Okay, thank you.
It happened maybe about a year ago, I want to say.
All right. Here's the question from Brigitte Lenormand. I'm wondering to what degree urban space in socialist states was shaped by global flows, even before the end of socialism. You can see the rest for yourself.
Oh, very much so, right? I mean, thank you, Brigitte. Right, Brigitte is one of those people who have worked on this, right? So this is a good segue to mention that, right? You know, Brigitte has written about New Belgrade as kind of a realization, one of the ultimate realizations of the ideas of the Athens Charter, right? Which is the product of modernist ideology that was much more ambiguous in terms of its relationship to political ideologies, right? This is Le Corbusier's kind of great idea from the radiant city that then found its application both in the East and the West. But even if we look at other models that were related or perhaps even different from the ideas of the Athens Charter, they have circulated internationally much more intensely that we want to often admit. My colleague Juliana Maxim wrote about how the idea of the neighborhood unit migrated between across the world, right, between the capitalist and socialist countries, using Bucharest as an example. So again, to kind of reinforce the point, these divisions that we're talking about really need to be questioned even further.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here from Isotta Poggi. Can you say something about the design of and importance placed on street furniture in socialist cities?
Oh wow, that's a great question. Again, and you know, I think it would be very difficult to give a unified answer. You know, just imagine trying to ask the same question about capitalist city, right? It's an entire world, right? There is the term second world that we now even use as a kind of a stand-in for the entire socialist world. So I think that it's a huge spectrum that's impossible to capture in one sentence, right? There was this, for a long time, there was this stereotype of the socialist housing neighborhoods across Eastern Europe where the buildings were constructed and nothing else was touched, right? So people kept walking through muddy paths for years before proper pavement and street furniture and everything else was installed. On the other hand, I know of a number of examples in Yugoslavia where actually the tremendous amount of attention was paid to such questions, right? And examples like Split 3 in Split in Croatia come to mind, or the housing neighborhood called Cerak Vinogradi in Belgrade, where the architects literally spent all of their time for years on the construction site, really creating an entire massive neighborhood, designing it as kind of a total work of art, where designing everything down from apartments and entire buildings down to benches and street signs and even kind of graphic design for house numbers. So again, I think it's a huge spectrum.
Great, thank you. I have Patricio Lopez here. A lot of social housing in the West, stereotypically of the modernist or brutalist kind, has not stood the test of time and is being demolished. Are there examples in the East where social housing experiments, success stories fared better?
Great question, and this is yet another kind of example to buttress my point, right? We know the famous example of Pride Igo, right, in St. Louis, which was demolished, and then famously Charles Jenks claimed that this was the symbolic end of modernist architecture, and this is the ultimate example of misinterpretation, right? Where the failure of the housing neighborhood was ascribed to the failure of architecture, right? In a way, this is the flip side to that overly ambitious idea that modernist architects took on themselves, that architecture can, on its own, resolve societal problems, right? Le Corbusier famously claimed architecture or a revolution, right? That if we invest in proper architecture, the revolution in capitalist society can be avoided. And in that sense, actually, I think that the difference between East and West is in terms of these massive housing neighborhoods is really interesting, because their fate in the East is very different. Not so much because of their shape, but because of the larger social dynamic. Of course, what happened in the West in general was with the rising prosperity with the Western welfare states, the more affluent citizens started moving into their private homes in the suburbs. That's especially the case in the US. Another problem in the US in particular was that these public housing projects ended up being defunded, right? There's a fantastic movie called the Pride Igo Myth that very clearly tracks this story. And this is something that did not happen in the East. The mix of social classes in the East survived for much longer. And in much of Eastern Europe, these socialist housing neighborhoods remain inhabited in similar ways as they used to be decades ago. And some of them are actually thriving as very desirable places to live, as kind of very ironically real estate market shows, right? New Belgrade, to go back to that example, is actually a very desirable place to live right now because it actually did, you know, the promises of modernism actually were realized. You have efficient traffic. You really are living in a park now that all the greenery has grown, and the apartments are not cheap there. It's a sought after place to live.
Great. So our time is unfortunately limited and we can't go over all the questions, but I would like to end on this note from Patty Manhart, which I think is very appropriate. Are there lessons to take from this era and apply to public housing today? What would you say?
You know, it's a great question. And I struggled with that question this entire semester because I taught the studio here at Iowa State, which was a housing studio, and where we tried to design an affordable housing building. And of course, what we realized quickly is that through research, my students did really fantastic research, was that the truly arcane system of public housing is really fraught with problems which are politically generated, right? That there's a tremendous lack of funding and investment. And the access to subsidized housing is incredibly restricted. And in that sense, ultimately, the question is not architectural, it's fundamentally political, right? Architecture as a profession, right? And the culture that develops a body of knowledge, I think, is actually way ahead of the political system and what the political systems allow. So I think really the struggle is fundamentally political rather than architectural.
Right. On that note, Vladimir, I want to thank you for a really brilliant conversation. Thank you very much. Next week.
Thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for attending. I'm really humbled by the numbers.
Right. No, it was great. Next week, I'm speaking with Dagmar Hoverstedt, who is the spokesperson for the commissioner of the Stasi records in Berlin, about secret space and the Stasi. So I hope you will join me again next week, same time. Bye-bye.